Her two young daughters were happily playing by the waves, building sandcastles under the sun. Alexandra stepped away, just for a moment, but when she returned, they were gone. No footprints, no screams, no trace. For 8 torturous months, the heartbroken mother searched every corner of Australia, working with police, chasing rumors, clinging to hope. Then one day, while posting new missing person signs at a remote beach, a seaplane pilot approached her with a story that would change everything. The pilot described flying over a private island, supposedly uninhabited, when he noticed movement below, small figures weaving through the trees. It wasn't wildlife. It was people. Maybe children. Alexandra's heart pounded. She had followed hundreds of leads, but this one felt different. Urgent, real. Soon after, Alexandra stood at the edge of a remote beach in Western Australia, the wind tugging at her jacket, the sea stretching endlessly before her. She stepped out of the police car beside Ben, the plainclothes officer who had helped her chase every lead. He nodded and led her toward a small wooden outpost nestled near the dunes. Unlike Queensland's bustling beaches, this place was nearly deserted. A few locals strolled the shoreline, but otherwise it was quiet. Too quiet. At the outpost, Ben flashed his badge to the 2 men at the entrance. They stepped aside, letting them in. The lodge was simple. Coastal maps pinned on corkboards, an old radio buzzing faintly, a few chairs tucked in the corners. 3 local officers turned as they entered. Ben made introductions. "This is Alexandra, the mother of the missing girls, Casey and Chloe." A tall officer nodded solemnly. "We remember the Queensland case. We've seen the reports." Alexandra stood tall, clenching her purse. 8 months, she said. "They vanished from a beach. I turned my back for 5 minutes. Ben added, "We've searched across every state. Now we're combing the West Coast. This might be the last viable lead." Officer Davis, weathered and kind, stepped forward. "We'll help however we can. We've got a sweet plan for the next few days." "Alexandra wants to post missing children signs around the beach and town," Ben said. "Of course," Davis replied. "Use any space you need." "Thank you," Alexandra whispered. "I'd like to start before it gets too hot." Ben nodded. "I'll stay here with the team. Call me when you're ready." She stepped outside, the sun now high above the horizon. As she moved toward the shoreline, Ben called out gently, "Don't forget what we discussed." Alexandra paused. "I know. 8 months. If nothing turns up by month's end," he said softly, "we may need to change direction." "You mean stop?" she said, her voice thin. He looked away. "We've followed everything." She nodded, her expression hardening. "Then I have work to do." Ben handed her several wooden stakes with laminated posters, along with a stack of flyers. "Call me when you're done." Alone, Alexandra walked the beach, clutching the posters. Each step triggered memories of the day her world shattered. That morning had been for mourning. They scattered David's ashes into the ocean, saying goodbye to the man cancer took far too soon. Afterward, her daughters played in the sand while she walked to a nearby cafe. 5 minutes. That was all it took. She planted the first stake, pressing it firmly into the sand. Her daughters' faces smiled back at her from the posters. "I will find you," she whispered. She moved steadily along the beach, stopping at visible points. By a lifeguard station, near the boardwalk, outside a rest area. A few locals took an interest. An elderly couple offered their sympathies, remembering the news story. A surfer grabbed a flyer, promising to alert his group. Small kindnesses, but enough to give her strength. As the sun climbed higher, she paused to rest in a shaded spot. That's when she saw it. An overgrown trail winding into a rocky bluff at the far end of the beach. Her breath caught. Something about it felt overlooked. Curious, she approached. The path was narrow but recently used. Crushed leaves, faint footprints. Her pulse quickened. Some prints looked small, like a child's. But the prints were intent, precision, power, competence, ruthless, a life of dedicated selflessness, and she followed the trail carefully, brushing aside branches. It opened into a small cove, hidden from view unless someone knew exactly where to look. It was quiet. too quiet. No toys, no clothes. But something felt off. A presence, a possibility. She grabbed her phone and called Ben. "I found something," she said, her breath shaky. "There's a path near the rocks. It's been used. And I think, by kids." "I'm on my way," he replied. "Don't move. Don't touch anything." The breeze off the water carried the distant cries of gulls and the faint rustle of seagrass swaying along the dunes. Alexandra stood in that cove, her eyes combing every inch, every stone, every footprint, every broken twig. There was no clear evidence, no toys or scraps of clothing to tie the space directly to her daughters, but instinct screamed that this place mattered. Something had happened here, or was still happening. She backed up slowly from the mouth of the trail and found a perch on a driftwood log. She needed to collect her thoughts. Her mind raced through 100 scenarios. What if her girls had been here? What if they still were? What if this was just another dead end? But something about the careful placement of each footprint, the size of them, the narrowness of the trail, these weren't the marks of hikers or adults exploring. This was different. 10 minutes later, the sound of tires crunching on sand reached her ears. Ben's figure appeared over the rise, jogging toward her with 2 officers in tow. She rose to meet him, pointing toward the path. "It's down there," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "And I swear to you, Ben, I felt something. Like a presence." Ben gave her a nod, calm, steady, and signaled the other officers to move in slowly. As they disappeared down the trail, he stayed beside her. "I've never seen you like this," he said. "It's different this time," Alexandra replied, eyes locked on the trail's entrance. "I feel it in my chest." They waited. Finally, one officer emerged holding something in a gloved hand. A small, pink, plastic hair clip. Alexandra froze. Her knees buckled, but Ben caught her. She didn't sob, she didn't scream. She stared, silent, stunned. After 8 months. It was the first physical sign. Hope returned. And for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. It felt real. Alexandra refused to accept the simplest and most tragic explanations. Her daughters hadn't just wandered off. They hadn't drowned. Casey and Chloe were bright, cautious, especially near water. They knew better than to stray too far. Alexandra's maternal instincts screamed a different truth. Someone had taken them. Someone who knew how to vanish without a trace. She found a dry patch of sand just above the tide line, close enough to catch the attention of any beachgoer passing by. Dropping to her knees, she began digging with her hands. Each movement was deliberate, methodical. When the hole was deep enough, she pressed a wooden stake into it, pushing until it stood firm. She brushed the sand from her palms and stepped back to look at the laminated poster, now anchored in the earth. 2 little girls smiled back at her. Casey's grin revealed a gap where her first baby tooth had recently fallen out. Something she'd been excited to show everyone in the weeks before she disappeared. Chloe, just a year younger, had those deep dimples that always popped up when she giggled. They were 6 and 5, so innocent, so easily swept away by a world too cruel for children. Alexandra's eyes remained fixed on their images. The wind tugged at her coat. The surf roared quietly behind her. She turned to face the vast ocean stretching to the horizon and whispered a prayer, not to a specific deity, but to whatever force might be listening. Somewhere out there, her daughters were waiting. Ben's words echoed again in her mind. The official police stance had become clear over the months. If the girls were still alive, someone would have spotted them. A neighbor, a tourist, a camera. There would have been a ransom note, digital footprints, credit card activity, internet searches, something. But there had been nothing, not even a whisper. And to most investigators, that silence meant the worst. Deep in thought, Alexandra almost didn't notice the faint buzzing in the distance. The sound grew louder, cutting through the rhythmic crash of waves. She looked up. A small seaplane was descending from the sky, its pontoons skimming the water's surface in a smooth, practiced landing. For a moment, Alexandra panicked, thinking she'd planted the sign in an unauthorized landing area. She moved toward it, prepared to pull it up, when she noticed a man exiting the aircraft. He jogged toward her, waving one hand. "I'm sorry," she called out, already pulling at the stake. "I didn't realize this was a landing zone. I'll move it right away." No, it's fine," the man replied, waving her off. "This isn't a usual stop for me." He approached quickly. Tall, with sun-creased skin and hair tousled by wind, he looked like someone accustomed to being outdoors. "Robert Martin," he said, offering his hand. "I recognize the photos from the news." Alexandra shook his hand cautiously. "I appreciate it, but I don't really have time right now." "I'm not here for that," he interrupted gently, his tone awkward but sincere. "I think I may have seen your daughters." Her heart skipped. "What? Where?" "I was flying low over Middle Island, just off the coast," he explained, pointing toward the horizon. "It's supposed to be uninhabited, but I saw two girls about the same age as the ones on your poster." Alexandra blinked rapidly, trying to steady herself. "Middle Island?" "It's private," Robert continued, "marked that way on maps. That's why it caught my attention. They weren't alone either. Two men were with them on the beach. I didn't get a clear look from the air, but after seeing your poster, I had to say something." Her grip on the stake tightened, fingers turning white. "We have to tell the police, now!" Robert nodded. "That's where I was heading when I saw you." For the first time in months, something sparked inside Alexandra. Hope. Sharp, sudden, and terrifying in its fragility. Could it be real this time? Together, they walked quickly back to the security lodge. As they entered, Ben was still speaking with Officer Davis and the others. Everyone turned as the door swung open. "Alexandra?" Ben stood up. "What's going on?" Officer Davis nodded at Robert. "Didn't expect to see you today, Martin." "I need to report something," Robert said without hesitation. "I saw two young girls on Middle Island. A couple of men were with them." Ben's demeanor shifted immediately, his posture straightening. "That island's private, isn't it?" "Yeah," Davis replied. "Owned by a handful of wealthy individuals, not typically occupied." Robert turned to Alexandra. "When I saw you here, the resemblance between those girls and your daughters hit me." "Are you certain?" Ben asked carefully. "I'm not 100%, Robert admitted. I was flying, and it wasn't a close view." Davis moved to the computer and began typing rapidly. "Could have been the owner's kids," he suggested. "Let's check the property registry." Alexandra stepped closer, her voice shaking. "Please, even if there's a chance, I need to know." "We understand," Ben said, though his tone remained neutral. The room fell silent, the only sound the keyboard clicking beneath Davis's fingers. Alexandra's eyes jumped between the screen and the officers' faces. "Here we go," Davis announced. "Middle Island is registered to 3 individuals based in Perth and Sydney. All have children, several of them young girls between the ages of 4 and 8. Alexandra's chest tightened. That hope, so recently ignited, flickered dangerously. Davis leaned back in his chair. Most likely, what Robert saw were their kids. Mystery solved. "No," Alexandra said firmly, her head shaking. "It's not solved, not yet." Her tone silenced the room. The certainty in her voice, the unwavering conviction, it cut through the bureaucracy like a blade. Robert stood beside her, shifting uncomfortably, but still nodding in support. Officer Davis looked momentarily caught off guard, but Ben, always reading the room, gave a slight nod. "We can't jump to conclusions. Let's not rule anything out." Alexandra took a deep breath, steadying herself. "If there's even a sliver of a possibility that those were my daughters, we need to act. I've waited 8 months. I can't walk away from a lead just because it might be inconvenient." "I'll put in a request for a field check," Davis said after a moment. "We can send someone to Middle Island by boat. Maybe even get aerial surveillance." Robert raised a hand. "I can fly again. I still have fuel and time before my next job. I know the exact location." Ben nodded. "All right, let's do this properly. I'll go with you. Davis, get a patrol team ready for water transport. If this turns into something, we need backup close." Alexandra stood in stunned silence. For so long, every door had closed on her. Now, finally, one was opening. It might be a crack, but it was enough to shine a light through. Outside the lodge, the sky remained clear. The breeze had picked up, lifting grains of sand into delicate spirals. As Robert and Ben prepped for flight, Alexandra stood near the edge of the dunes, staring out at the horizon. Somewhere past that blue line was Middle Island, mysterious, off-limits, and now possibly the key to everything. She whispered her daughter's names into the wind as if the breeze itself could carry her voice across the waves. Casey? Chloe? Mommy's coming. For the first time in months, she wasn't looking backward in sorrow. She was looking forward. To answer, to the truth. To the hope that maybe, just maybe, the end of this nightmare was within reach. You don't know that for sure, Alexandra said, her voice tight with emotion. Please. Couldn't someone just go check? Just to be certain? Officer Davis exchanged a long look with his colleagues before speaking. Mrs. Hamilton, your daughters were reported missing from Queensland, thousands of kilometers from here. It's extremely unlikely. Unlikely doesn't mean impossible, Alexandra cut in, her voice cracking. I've been searching for 8 months, every day, every hour. What's one more check? What if they're there and we ignore them? What if we do nothing and regret it for the rest of our lives? Ben stepped forward cautiously. Alexandra, I understand how you feel, but... No, you don't, she said, turning sharply to face him. You can't understand what it's like to lose your children, to not know if they're alive or dead, to imagine their voices crying out for you every time you close your eyes at night. The room went quiet. Even Officer Davis looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other. Ben finally broke the silence with a softer tone. What about a compromise? We'll send officers out to the island, just to be thorough. They can ask around, confirm whether anyone there has seen children who match Casey and Chloe's description. Officer Davis sighed, but eventually gave a slow nod. I suppose we can arrange something. Thank you, Alexandra whispered, her entire body sagging with relief. Wait outside with Robert, Ben told her gently. We'll discuss the logistics in here. She gave a nod and followed Robert Martin out of the room, her heart thudding erratically in her chest. Hope and fear surged together inside her, creating a dizzying mixture that made it hard to breathe. Behind her, the door clicked shut, sealing her off from the conversation, now shifting into action. Inside, she could hear Ben's voice, firm and focused, as he directed plans with the local authorities. I hope I didn't get your hopes up too high, Robert said, as they stood in the midday sun, which now cast stark shadows over the sand. Alexandra shook her head. Don't apologize. We don't know what they'll find yet. Before Robert could respond, the door opened, and Ben stepped out, followed closely by 2 uniformed officers. Their faces were sun-weathered, their movements unhurried but practiced. Local men, clearly familiar with the terrain. Alexandra, Ben said, we've arranged for these 2 officers to accompany Robert to Middle Island. They know the property owners, which will help smooth over the visit. The taller officer gave her a small nod. We'll be thorough, ma'am. You have my word. Robert stepped forward. I can fly them in. It'll be faster than taking a boat. Ben considered this briefly, then nodded. That would help a lot. Thank you. As the men coordinated their approach, Alexandra stood to the side, watching every move intently. She wanted desperately to go with them. She wanted to be there when they landed, when they asked questions, when they saw the girls. But she knew they wouldn't allow it. She wasn't law enforcement. She wasn't equipped. Robert approached her before boarding. Here's my number, he said, handing over a business card. If anything comes up, or if you hear something, call me. She took it and gave him her own number in return. Thank you for everything. Most people wouldn't have stopped to help. He nodded, his expression serious. I just hope it leads to something. I'll call the moment we know more. Alexandra and Ben stood side by side on the sand, watching as Robert and the officers boarded the seaplane. The engine came to life with a loud roar, kicking up spray as the aircraft moved across the water and finally lifted into the air. It grew smaller and smaller until it vanished over the horizon. Now we wait, Ben said softly. He turned to her, concern etched across his features. You look like you haven't slept in days. Alexandra forced a thin smile. I haven't, really. But I'm fine. No, you're not, Ben said gently. I've booked you an apartment in town. It's quiet, not far from here. You need rest while we wait for news. She started to protest, but exhaustion caught up to her. Maybe you're right, she said at last. The drive took about 15 minutes through the sleepy coastal town. Quaint shops lined the main road, their windows filled with shells, trinkets, and postcards. Most were closed or empty due to the midday heat. At the apartment building, a modest two-story complex with whitewashed walls and bright blue shutters, Ben handled the check-in while Alexandra stood near the entrance, her mind unable to rest. Would the officers recognize her daughters? Would they search thoroughly enough? What if they brushed it off too quickly? The question circled in her thoughts like a whirlwind, dragging her deeper into anxiety. Room 204, Ben said, handing her the key. I'll come by once we hear anything. Please, try to sleep. She took the key and offered a quiet thank you for everything. It's my job, he replied, but the warmth in his voice suggested it was more than that. Call me if you need anything. Inside, the apartment was simple but clean, a kitchenette, a sitting area, and a neatly made bed through an open doorway. On the small dining table sat the stack of missing child posters she'd been carrying. Casey and Chloe smiled up at her, two tiny faces frozen in time. The silence of the room settled around her, pressing inward. How could she possibly rest when her daughters might be within reach? Just across the water? The thought of waiting in that apartment, doing nothing, was unbearable. She grabbed her purse and the posters. The rest could wait. Alexandra moved methodically through the quiet town. Her hands worked quickly, taping flyers to lampposts, placing them on cafe windows and pinning them to community bulletin boards. Locals watched her, some with curiosity, others with recognition. She offered brief explanations, handing out the flyers to anyone willing to take one. Each poster was more than paper. It was a plea, a desperate cry from a mother who refused to surrender. Somewhere someone might know something. Someone might remember a detail. She couldn't afford to overlook even the smallest chance. As she finished taping another flyer to the grocery store's bulletin board, she caught her reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, messy hair, determination is carved into every feature. She whispered to herself, "Just hold on, girls. I'm not giving up." The late afternoon sun filtered through the buildings, casting long golden streaks across the sidewalk. Alexandra turned down another street, pressing posters into empty spaces, scanning every passerby's face with anxious hope. Could one of them know something? Had anyone seen a child who looked like Casey? Or Chloe? She asked softly, respectfully, wherever she could. At the post office, at a beachside diner, even an old marina shack. Most hadn't. A few said they'd keep an eye out. Still, it wasn't anything. By the time she reached the far end of town, her stack of posters had thinned to just a few. Her feet ached and her shoulders slumped, but she wasn't done. Not yet. She passed a little girl skipping rope outside a corner store, about Chloe's age. The sight stopped her in her tracks. For a split second, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Chloe, of course, but it reminded her of everything that mattered. She turned back toward the center of town, determined to keep going until the last poster was gone. If the search on the island turned up nothing, she'd still have these people, this town, watching with her. That mattered. Hope didn't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it was just a mother walking from store to store, refusing to stop until the whole world knew her daughters were still out there. Somewhere. The town lay under a blanket of quiet heat. The streets were nearly empty, the few people who ventured out moving slowly under the weight of the afternoon sun. Alexandra continued her search through the main stretch, past sleepy storefronts and shuttered cafes. Most of those she encountered offered sympathetic smiles and soft apologetic words. But when she asked, always gently, always with hope, if they'd seen her daughters, the answer was the same. "I'm sorry, no." Their kindness felt real, their regret seemed heartfelt, but none of it filled the void of what she needed, a lead, a sighting, a clue. The emptiness in their eyes mirrored her own growing despair. As the paved road gave way to a patch of open green, Alexandra stepped into a small town park. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. Scattered benches lay in the shade of twisted trees, and a brightly colored playground sat deserted in the midday glare. Her footsteps crunched softly along the gravel path as she approached a lamp-post near the park's edge. She removed one of her remaining posters and carefully smoothed it against the metal, securing the edges with tape she'd borrowed earlier from a shopkeeper. "Those are your little ones?" a voice asked from behind. Startled, Alexandra turned to find an elderly man standing several feet away. He was lean, with sun-darkened skin and sharp, weather-beaten features. His clothes were plain, a pair of well-worn khaki pants and a faded blue shirt buttoned neatly at the collar. He looked as though he'd spent his entire life outdoors. "Yes," Alexandra replied, her voice catching slightly. She turned back to the poster, smoothing its corners again. "They've been missing for 8 months." The man stepped closer, squinting at the photos. "Thought so," he muttered. "They look familiar." Her heart jumped, but she kept her expression guarded. "Familiar?" she repeated, trying not to let her hopes rise too quickly. "You've seen them?" The man tilted his head thoughtfully, eyes never leaving the photographs. "Maybe. Can't say for sure. But I got a good memory for faces, especially young ones. I'm a fisherman, been out on these waters all my life." "Please," Alexandra said, keeping her voice steady with effort. "Any information at all could help." He scratched his chin, thinking. "It was a while back. Some morning, just before sunrise, I was heading out to sea. Saw a big yacht heading toward Middle Island." The name sent a jolt through her chest. "There were 2 little girls on the deck," he added. "Hard to say for sure, but they looked a lot like the ones on that poster." Alexandra went pale. "Middle Island?" "Yeah," the man nodded. "It's mostly private rich folks own the land, keep to themselves. Not many boats go near it." He leaned closer to study the poster again. "Now that I look at these photos, I'd say the girls I saw looked mighty similar. But, kids can look alike from a distance." "When exactly did you see them?" she pressed. "Please, try to remember." "A few months ago, maybe more. I couldn't give you a date. But don't forget the water. The yacht was out of place. That's why I noticed." Alexandra reached into her purse for her phone. "Would you be willing to speak with the police?" At once the man's demeanor changed. He stepped back, eyes narrowing. "No phones, no cops. And the authorities don't see eye to eye." "They're my daughters," Alexandra pleaded. "Please." He shook his head. "I've said what I've seen. That's all I got for you." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "If you need to find me, ask around for Micah's lodge, north end of the beach." Before she could respond, he added in a tone that sent a chill down her spine, "Don't trust everyone around here, miss. Not everyone's what they seem." With that, he turned and walked away, his pace slow but steady. Alexandra watched him until he disappeared around a curve in the path. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down on a nearby bench, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 2 people now, Robert and this fisherman, had pointed toward Middle Island. Could it really be a coincidence? Or was something being hidden in plain sight? She pulled out her phone to call Ben. Just as she did, it started ringing in her hand. His name lit up the screen. She answered immediately. "Ben, did they find anything?" "We just returned from the island," he replied, his voice calm and professional. "They spoke to the owners. There are children on the island, yes, but they're the daughters of the residents. None of them are Casey or Chloe." "Are they sure?" Alexandra asked, heart pounding. "Did they check thoroughly?" "Yes," Ben said. "They questioned everyone. No one has seen your daughters." The news hit her like a punch to the chest. The hope she'd let herself feel began to unravel. "We're back to square one," Ben said gently. Alexandra closed her eyes. Images of the fisherman and his warning ran through her mind like a loop. Something didn't add up. "I want to speak with those officers myself," she said firmly. "I get it," Ben replied with a sigh. "But that won't change the outcome. We're planning to move to the next town tomorrow. The local authorities will continue looking while we're here." Alexandra stayed silent, thinking. Don't trust everyone. Why would the old man say that? And why had 2 separate individuals mentioned girls who resembled her daughters on an island where police found nothing? "Alexandra," Ben asked after a long pause. "I'm here," she replied quietly. "You're right, we should move on." They ended the call shortly after, but Alexandra didn't rise from the bench. She stared down at the poster in her lap. Her instincts screamed that this wasn't over. Her girls had been missing for 8 months because too many stones had been left unturned. Too many people had accepted unlikely as good enough. Not her. Not anymore. She stood up with renewed determination. Just beyond the edge of the park, a yellow taxi idled near the curb. Alexandra waved it down and climbed into the back seat. "Micah's Lodge," she told the driver, buckling her seatbelt. "It's near the north end of the beach." The driver nodded. "Old Fisherman's Place? Been there forever, I know it." As the car pulled away from the park, Alexandra stared out the window, fists clenched in her lap. If answers didn't come to her, she would go find them herself. The taxi rolled past weathered cottages and dune-lined walkways, the kind of roads that didn't exist on any tourist map. As they neared the north end of the beach, the landscape grew sparser, wilder. Patches of dry grass and wind-stunted trees gave the place an air of neglect. Eventually, the driver slowed and pointed ahead. "There," he said, nodding toward a faded wooden sign half hidden by vines. "Micah's Lodge." Alexandra stepped out, her shoes crunching on gravel. The small building looked more like an old shack than a lodge. A sagging roof, a front porch scattered with fishing gear, and windows thick with salt and dust. But there was a quiet stillness to it that felt deliberate, almost guarded. She approached the door, heart pounding. No bell, no sign of movement. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open slowly. It wasn't locked. Inside, the space was dim and smelled of salt and old wood. A single light bulb flickered above the entryway. A pair of boots sat neatly by the door. On a small table, she spotted an old radio, a chipped coffee mug, and what looked like a logbook filled with scribbled notes. "Hello?" she called out cautiously. "It's Alexandra. We spoke earlier." No response. She stepped further inside, eyes scanning the shadows. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, like its occupant had just stepped out, or was watching. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to back down. A faint breeze rattled a window pane as she moved toward the table. Her eyes landed on something beside the logbook, a folded paper map of the coast. Several locations were marked in pencil, and one of them was circled, Middle Island. She reached out and gently pressed her fingers to the paper. The pencil line was fresh. Recent. "Micah," she whispered to the silence. "I need answers." But the silence offered none. Still, she knew this wasn't over. She had followed leads across hundreds of kilometers, trusted strangers, and defied authorities. She was tired, she was desperate, but she was also resolved. Whatever secrets this island held, Alexandra wasn't turning away. No, not ever. The taxi wound through narrow, sun-drenched streets, eventually curving onto a quiet coastal road that hugged the edge of the shoreline. The sea shimmered just beyond the window, waves rolling gently against the rocks. After about 10 minutes, the paved surface gave way to a dirt track, and the driver slowed as the tires crunched over loose gravel. Up ahead, scattered wooden huts stood like silent sentinels against the sea breeze. Salt-worn and faded, they blended almost seamlessly into the sandy coastline. "That's the fisherman's stretch," the driver said, gesturing. "Micah's place, that'll be the third hut down." Alexandra nodded and paid the fare. The moment she stepped out, the scent of the ocean hit her. Strong with salt, tinged with fish, and threaded with something ancient. Nets hung drying from wooden racks. Small boats sat pulled up high on the shore, cradled in sand. A handful of men worked quietly, mending gear or gutting the last of their catch. Their heads lifted as she passed, eyes following her with quiet curiosity but saying nothing. She made her way toward the third hut, each footstep sinking slightly into the warm sand. The structure was compact but solid, its walls aged to a weathered silver gray. Fishing tools dangled from hooks outside, and driftwood was stacked neatly by the entrance. The old man she had spoken to earlier, now properly introduced as Justin, sat on a crate out front, his gnarled hands moving methodically as he cleaned a set of fishing lures. He looked up at the sound of her approach. "So," he said without surprise, "you found me." "I need to know more," Alexandra replied without hesitation. "What you saw. And what did you mean when you said not to trust everyone?" Justin paused, setting aside his tools. He glanced around the beach, as if ensuring no one was listening. "Name's Justin," he said. "Micah was my father." His face, lined by years under the sun, hardened at the memory. "He's gone now. Cops locked him up over something he never did, claimed he was fishing too close to Middle Island while some city folks were visiting, said he trespassed. They made up charges. He got beat bad in lockup." Justin's voice dropped. "Didn't make it out." Alexandra's heart twisted. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, but the pain lingered in his eyes. 2 years? Still, it's why I don't trust the authorities, not around here, especially not when it comes to that island. "What can you tell me about it?" Alexandra asked. "The people who own it? Wealthy types from Perth, Sydney, families with money and lawyers, been passing the land down through generations, used to be just them, coming in for holidays, bringing their friends, throwing parties. But lately?" He picked up a lure, spinning it slowly in his hand. "Lately, I've seen children. A lot more children than I remember." "Children?" Alexandra leaned forward, pulse quickening. "Yeah. Kids come and go, different ones all the time. Sometimes 2, sometimes 4, or 5. Never see the same faces twice. Not like a normal family's routine. It's strange." "Are you saying—" she hesitated. "Are you suggesting they're taking children?" Justin didn't answer directly. He set down the lure with care. "In this world, nothing surprises me anymore." Alexandra's breath caught in her throat. "When you came asking about your daughters," Justin continued, "and said that the pilot saw 2 little girls on the island, it clicked. I've been watching that place for a long time." "The police already checked," she said. "They told me the kids belong to the island owners." Justin scoffed. "And you believed them? After 2 strangers told you they saw girls matching your daughter's descriptions?" "I don't know what to believe," she admitted, her voice raw. "Come with me," he said suddenly, standing and motioning toward the back of the hut. Alexandra followed him around the structure, where a pair of high-powered binoculars hung from a nail. He handed them to her, then pointed to the sea. "Look out there." She lifted the binoculars, adjusting the lenses until the view sharpened. Waves shimmered under the fading afternoon light. Then she saw it. A sleek, white luxury yacht slicing across the water. "Zoom in," Justin urged. She adjusted the focus further. The figures on the deck came into view, a handful of men in loose-fitting clothes. And then her breath caught. 2 small figures stood near the railing, hair blowing in the wind. "Are those—" her voice broke. "Are those my daughters?" Justin narrowed his eyes. "They're heading back to the main island, and they aren't alone." Tears welled up as Alexandra stared, frozen. Casey and Chloe. It had to be them. After 8 endless months, there they were. "I need to call Ben and Roger," she said, still clutching the binoculars. "I need help." She turned to Justin, her voice shaking. "Thank you." "I don't know how I can ever repay you," the old man waved off her gratitude. "Just make sure those men end up behind bars. That's all the payment I want." As she stepped away from his hut, the sky burned orange and crimson. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the sand. There were no taxis here, no traffic, just silence and urgency. She reached for her phone, hand trembling. Her first instinct was to call Ben. But then she hesitated. Justin's warning echoed in her mind. Don't trust everyone, especially not those tied to the local authorities. Ben had worked with them, coordinated every effort. What if he was compromised? She opened her contact list and scrolled to Roger's number instead. The pilot had seen her daughters before. He had no reason to lie. Her thumb hovered over the screen, then pressed call. He answered on the third ring. "Hello, Alexandra?" "I need your help," she said breathlessly. "I just saw them, Casey and Chloe. They're on a yacht heading to the main island." "I'm certain it's them." "That's incredible timing," Robert said quickly. "I was just about to call you. I'm at One Arm Point airstrip. I just landed from a survey flight. I thought I saw that same yacht on my way in." "You saw it too?" Alexandra clutched the phone harder, pacing the sand with growing desperation. "I didn't get close, but the vessel matched the description from before, and it was heading straight for the private docks near Kings Bay. That's where they usually anchor." "I'm going to meet you there," she said. "We can intercept it." Robert paused. "Alexandra, are you sure you want to go there without backup? This could be dangerous." "I don't care. I'm not waiting around for the police to make another mistake. I'm going. I need to see my daughters. I need to know." "All right," Robert agreed. "I'll wait for you at the airfield entrance. Hurry." She ended the call and turned back toward Justin's hut. He was still there, watching the ocean like a man who trusted the sea more than people. "I'm going after them," she said. He nodded solemnly. "I figured as much." "You've done enough," she added, her voice sincere. "Thank you, truly." Justin gave her a sad, knowing smile. "If you find 'em, bring 'em home. That's all that matters now." The sun had dipped below the horizon, the last light casting a faint glow across the water. Alexandra ran along the beach, back toward the road, adrenaline overriding her exhaustion. Her shoes kicked up sand, heart pounding in rhythm with her steps. She would stop at nothing. Her daughters were alive. And this time, she would not let them slip away. "I can see a yacht approaching the mainland." Robert's voice came through the phone, urgent but steady. "There are 2 young girls on board who look remarkably similar to your daughters from the photos." Alexandra's breath caught in her throat. "Where exactly are they heading, do you know?" "The marina appear to be making for the private marina just north of town," he said. "I don't want to lose them. If I move from here, I'll lose visual." "Stay where you are," Alexandra said without hesitation. "Keep watching them. I'll call Ben and get him to meet you there with officers." "Got it." "I'll keep the line open. If anything changes, I'll let you know immediately." Alexandra ended the call and quickly dialed Ben's number. Despite her earlier doubts, she knew he had the authority and access to more manpower than she could hope for alone. "Alexandra?" Ben answered almost immediately. "Is everything all right?" "I found them," she said, heart racing. "They're on a yacht heading toward the main island right now. Robert can see them from the airport, and I saw them myself through binoculars from a fisherman's lodge." "Wait, slow down," Ben interrupted. "What fisherman?" She quickly filled him in about Justin, his warning, his story about Middle Island, and the suspicions about the island's owners and possible corruption among local authorities. "That's a serious accusation," Ben replied, his tone measured. "Where are you now?" "I'm just outside Justin's place, near the coast, near the edge of town. I know how this sounds, but I'm certain it's them. 2 people have seen girls matching my daughter's descriptions, and now I've seen them with my own eyes." There was a pause on the line before Ben responded. "Stay there. I'm coming to get you. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't approach anyone else or make any more calls." Alexandra paced the sand while she waited, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sea swallowed the last of the sun's golden light. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime. Within minutes, Ben's vehicle rolled into view, kicking up sand and dust as it came to a stop beside her. He leaned across the passenger seat and opened the door. "Get in." She slid inside without a word. "We need to move. They're getting close to shore. We can't let them disappear again." Ben nodded and pulled away from the beach, his jaw set with determination. "Tell me exactly what Justin told you." As they sped through the narrow coastal road, Alexandra recounted every word. Justin's warnings about the children seen on the island, the rotating appearances, the sense that something dark was hidden behind the wealth and privacy. "If what he's saying is true," Ben said finally, "then we're dealing with something bigger than just a missing persons case. If the local authorities are covering for them—" "I don't care how deep this goes," Alexandra interrupted. "I just want Casey and Chloe back." Ben nodded. "I understand. But we need to be smart. First, are you absolutely certain the girls on that yacht are your daughters?" Alexandra turned to him, her voice firm. "I know what I saw. A mother knows." Ben held her gaze for a moment longer before giving a small nod. "All right. Here's what we're going to do. He tapped his earpiece. I'm going to call Robert back for an updated location and then loop in my team, the ones from Queensland, not the local officers. As Ben made the call, he put it on speaker so Alexandra could hear. Robert, it's Ben. I've got Alexandra with me. What's your current position? They're still moving along the coast, Robert replied quickly. Looks like they're preparing to dock at a private beach just west of Kings Bay. Could be making a handoff or just regrouping. Ben's eyes narrowed. Give me your exact coordinates. Robert read them off and Ben entered them into his GPS. We'll be there in less than 10 minutes. I'm bringing in my Queensland team and alerting state authorities, completely bypassing the local police. If they're compromised, they'll tip off the suspects and we lose everything. Understood, Robert replied. I can intercept by air if they try to turn around. Do it. Stay in visual range and keep the line open. Ben handed the phone back to Alexandra, then grabbed a second device to make another secure call. Alexandra pressed Robert's phone close to her ear. Roger, can you still see them? Yes, Robert confirmed. They're still on deck, but wait, something's happening. The girls are being led below. I think they're preparing to dock. Alexandra's stomach twisted. Don't let them out of your sight. I won't. Ben ended his second call and turned to her. My team is en route from 2 directions. We'll box them in. If they try to flee by water, Robert can follow them. If they try to run inland, we'll be waiting. What about the local police? I just called the state commissioner directly. If the local officers show up and try anything, we'll know whose side they're on. Just then, Ben's radio crackled to life. Officer Hanson, this is dispatch. We've received reports of suspicious activity near Jolo Beach. Please confirm your position. Ben exchanged a glance with Alexandra, then pressed the button. This is Hanson. I'm en route to Jolo Beach now with Mrs. Hamilton. ETA 5 minutes. Copy that. Local units have been dispatched as well. Ben turned off the radio and stepped harder on the gas. Now we see where their loyalties lie. By the time they reached the cliff overlooking Jolo Beach, dusk had blanketed the landscape. The ocean was dark except for the faint outlines of anchored boats near the dock. Ben pulled the car to a stop on a high-rise, giving them a clear view of the entire bay. They're here, Alexandra whispered, pointing. Sure enough, the yacht was just offshore, drifting closer to a private dock nestled between dunes. Ben raised a pair of night binoculars from the glove compartment and peered through them. Robert was right. There are 3 men on deck. No sign of the girls now, probably below, like he said. As if on cue, Robert's voice crackled through the phone. They've cut the engine, anchoring now. Alexandra's fingers clenched into fists. Please, let them still be there. Ben tapped his comm again. Unit Bravo, do you have visual? A voice responded. Confirmed. We see the vessel, holding position until you give the order. The vehicle remained parked on the ridge as Ben and Alexandra surveyed the area, scanning for movement near the private dock. Shadows deepened as the last light disappeared behind the horizon, casting the beach in shades of silver and navy. A wind had picked up from the sea, rustling the dry grasses along the cliffs and carrying with it the scent of brine and anticipation. From their elevated position, Alexandra could just make out a group of small vehicles parked near a winding path that led down to the dock. At least one of them bore the insignia of local law enforcement. Ben's jaw tightened. We'll see soon enough if they're here to help or to warn, he said grimly. Alexandra couldn't speak. Her entire body thrummed with tension, her heart beat a steady roar in her ears. This was closer than she had ever come, closer than 8 months of searching had ever brought her. Ben's earpiece buzzed again. Team Alpha in position, came the quiet report. Awaiting go signal. He looked at her one last time, his voice low and resolute. You've done everything right. Now let us take it from here. She nodded, but her eyes stayed locked on the boat below, willing her daughters to be there, wishing them to be safe. Ben raised his radio. Execute. Through the binoculars, Ben spotted a sleek black SUV already stationed near the water's edge, its engine likely idling, waiting for the yacht to arrive. There, he said sharply, handing the binoculars to Alexandra. Look to the southern curve of the beach. The yacht's sending a small tender ashore. Alexandra brought the binoculars to her eyes, adjusting the focus with trembling fingers. The image sharpened. I see them. 2 men. One is tall and lean, the other broader, with a heavy build. She shifted her gaze slightly. Her breath hitched. The girls. They're carrying them. Oh my God. Ben grabbed the binoculars again, quickly focusing. His expression turned grim. They're limp, no resistance. It looks like they're unconscious. They've drugged them, Alexandra whispered, her voice cracking with horror. They drugged my babies. Ben lowered the binoculars slowly, jaw tight. If these really are your daughters, this confirms it. No parent would sedate their own children to move them like cargo. This isn't custody, it's abduction. We need to go, now. Alexandra reached for the door handle, adrenaline flooding her system. Ben placed a steady hand on her arm. Wait, we need to see what happens next. Look, those local police officers are arriving. Through the lens, they watched as two uniformed officers approached from the same security lodge they had visited earlier that day. The officers walked directly toward the two men. Tension rose in Alexandra's chest like a tide. There's an argument, Ben narrated, still observing through the binoculars. The heavy-set guy is getting agitated. He's waving his hands. Something's going down. Alexandra held her breath. What are they doing now? They're handing them something. Looks like envelopes. Ben paused, then quickly pulled out his phone and began recording through the binoculars. Bribery. They're buying their silence. You're sure? Alexandra asked, aghast. They're not even trying to hide it. Ben's voice was razor-sharp with restrained fury. The officers are taking the money without hesitation. This whole thing is rotten. They continued to watch in disbelief as the two men hoisted the girls, still unconscious, back onto the tender and motored back toward the yacht. The officers didn't interfere. Instead, they stood casually, even scanning the horizon to ensure no one interrupted. They're getting away, Alexandra said, panic threatening to overwhelm her. We can't let them leave. Not yet, Ben said firmly. We wait for the right moment. Robert should be in the air by now, and my team is almost in position. We're going to trap them, all of them. He tapped his earpiece. Robert, status? Robert's voice buzzed through. I've got visual on the yacht. They've pulled away from the dock. Looks like they're heading east again, toward deeper water. My team's on the move, Ben confirmed. Intercept on my signal. Alexandra gripped the dashboard, white-knuckled. What if something goes wrong? What if they hurt them? Ben turned to her, eyes steady. They've kept the girls alive this long. They clearly want them in good condition. That's their leverage. We're going to get them back, I promise. Tense minutes crawled by as they watched the yacht grow smaller, slicing through the waves. Ben called updates to his team, guiding them into position. The yacht's about half a kilometer out now, Ben said finally. Time to move. He activated his earpiece. All units, move in. Robert, you're cleared to intercept. Through the binoculars, Alexandra watched as a seaplane skimmed in low from the north, touching down with a spray of white water, blocking the yacht's path. At the same time, a speedboat appeared from behind a rocky inlet, heading directly for the yacht. It's happening, Ben said, shifting the car into gear. We're going down to the beach. Stay in the car until I give the all clear. He drove fast, bumping down the sandy trail toward the shore. The local officers at the scene turned in surprise as Ben's vehicle skidded to a halt. Ben stepped out calmly, purposefully. What's the plan? Alexandra asked, heart racing. I'm arresting them, Ben replied, already pulling his badge. The evidence is irrefutable. Stay here. Keep your eyes on the water. Let me handle this. Alexandra nodded, binoculars already back at her eyes. The seaplane had come to a stop directly in front of the yacht. From the speedboat, she saw dark figures climbing aboard, Ben's team, armed and tactical. One of the bodyguards on deck panicked, jumping overboard. A sharp crack echoed, likely a warning shot. He flailed, clutching his leg, while the others raised their hands in surrender. On the beach, Ben had reached the local officers. Alexandra couldn't hear the exchange, but she saw one of them back away, hand drifting toward his belt. Ben moved swiftly, twisting the man's arm and locking a pair of cuffs around his wrists. The other officer didn't resist. Both men were quickly searched, and Ben held up the thick envelopes for the nearby dashcam to record. Alexandra's eyes darted back to the water. Officers from the speedboat were escorting the captured men aboard a larger police vessel, but her focus was fixed on the seaplane. Two figures were being carried gently across the yacht's deck, small, limp, unmistakably children. Her voice caught. "That's them. That's Casey and Chloe." Ben turned and waved to her from the beach, signaling that it was safe. Alexandra didn't wait. She threw the door open and sprinted across the sand, her heart hammering in her chest. The air seemed thick, each step heavy with desperation and hope. "They've got them," Ben confirmed as she approached, breathless. "They're being transferred to Robert's plane. Paramedics will be waiting at the marina." Alexandra's knees nearly buckled with relief. Are they okay?" "They're unconscious but stable. Robert said they're breathing, no signs of distress. We'll get a full medical team to check them as soon as they land." Behind them, one of the arrested officers began protesting, his voice rising in disbelief. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "Those families bring money into this community." Ben turned, eyes hard. "They traffic in children. I don't care how much money they spend here." The shoreline glowed faintly in the twilight, illuminated by emergency beacons now blinking from the incoming police vessel. More vehicles were arriving up the road, kicking up dust clouds in the fading light. The sound of sirens echoed distantly, a sharp contrast to the rhythmic crash of waves. This remote corner of the coast, once peaceful and overlooked, had become the stage for a dramatic rescue that would soon make national headlines. Ben placed a steadying hand on Alexandra's shoulder as more of his Queensland team emerged from hidden positions, each coordinating the evidence collection, securing the suspects, and ensuring the area was contained. No one would escape tonight, not the kidnappers, not their accomplices. She turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. "If you hadn't believed me—" "You never gave me a reason not to," he said gently. Above them, the sky had turned deep indigo, the stars beginning to pierce through the veil of night. Somewhere out there, Robert was flying low and fast, bringing Casey and Chloe home. And Alexandra, standing barefoot in the sand, knew one truth above all. This nightmare was finally nearing its end. Through the binoculars, Ben spotted a sleek black luxury SUV already parked near the water's edge, its tinted windows reflecting the fading light. He handed the binoculars to Alexandra. "Look," he said quietly, voice steady. "It's parked right where the yacht's tender is heading." Alexandra raised the binoculars, her fingers trembling. She adjusted the focus until she saw two burly men stepping onto the yacht's deck from the small boat. "I see them. One tall and thin, the other heavyset. And they're carrying the girls." Her voice trembled. "They're limp. They've drugged them." Ben's jaw tightened. He snatched the binoculars back. "If those are your daughters, this confirms kidnapping. No caring parent would do this." "We have to stop them," Alexandra said, voice thick with urgency. "Now." Ben placed a calming hand on her arm. "Not yet. Watch." Through the binoculars, they saw two uniformed officers emerge from the lodge. One man shoved something at one of the officers. The next second, envelopes, thick bundles, changed hands. "Bribery," Ben said, voice cold with revulsion. "The officers are being paid off. They're letting them leave with my daughters," Alexandra hissed. "They think they've covered their tracks, but we have them in sight." Ben paused. His earpiece crackled. "Robert, status?" "I've got them, heading out to deeper water." Ben nodded. "Okay. Team's close." "Then go," Alexandra said, fists clenched. "Don't wait." Ben looked at her with calculated calm. "We'll trap them all, by sea and by land. I want eyes on this." He spoke quietly into his earpiece. Moments later, a seaplane descended in the distance, landing just ahead of the yacht. Simultaneously, a speedboat appeared on the opposite side, engines roaring quietly. "They're moving in," Ben stated, tension in his voice. He started the car and sped toward the beach, Alexandra clutching the binoculars in one hand. Sirens echoed faintly behind them as Ben screeched to a halt in the sand. "Stay in the car," he said firmly. "Let me handle this." Alexandra nodded, sliding out and bringing the binoculars back into view. From the speedboat, Ben's Queensland team, wearing tactical gear, boarded the yacht. One of the abductors panicked, tried to flee overboard. There was a sharp crack, then he slipped into the water, limping. The remaining assailants, surprised, raised their hands. On the beach, Ben confronted the two uniformed officers stepping toward the SUV. One reached for his holster. Ben disarmed him in an instant and slapped handcuffs on both. Alexandra watched, tears in her eyes, as the yacht's captors were subdued. Two small, limp forms were carefully carried from the yacht's railings back out toward the seaplane. "That's them, Casey and Chloe," she breathed, voice breaking. Ben signaled, "It's safe." Alexandra ran across the sand. She reached the shoreline as medical personnel lifted the girls into the plane. "They're okay. They're coming to the marina," Ben told her gently as paramedics checked their vitals. "They're breathing, no distress," one medic confirmed, wheeling a stretcher onto the tarmac. Alexandra's knees folded under her as relief washed over her. So they're safe?" "They'll wake soon," Ben said softly. "Everything is going to be fine." Nearby, a local officer stammered, "Those families, they donate, they support, the community." Ben's eyes were hard. "That doesn't give them the right to traffic children." The engines of the seaplane sputtered to life. Twice Ben placed a hand on Alexandra's arm. "If you hadn't trusted your instincts, if you hadn't insisted—" She shook her head. "I never gave up." The sky burned into night. Lights began flashing, the news crews that were already gathering, the local cops filing in. The coastline had changed forever. This rescue would make headlines. Ben's Queensland team arrived at the marina, coordinating the paperwork, evidence collection. Alexandra watched as Robert, the pilot, approached and murmured encouragement. She looked at Ben. "What happens next?" Ben guided her to a waiting SUV. "They'll take the suspects to the main station, not the local one. You'll need to give your statement." Alexandra nodded, her legs shaky. Minutes later, an ambulance whirred up and she followed the paramedics onto the plane ramp. Paramedics administered fluids and gentle support while Casey and Chloe slept. Both girls were small, thinner than she remembered, but unmistakably her children. Alexandra pressed a hand to each forehead. "Mommy's here." A medic said they were heavily sedated but stable, were monitoring their vitals, no immediate danger. Alexandra paused in the doorway. "I want to ride in the ambulance with them," she said. Ben took her hand. "Yes, you can. But first, I need your statement at the station. The statement will put all of these men, those on the yacht, the officers, the kidnappers, behind bars. You must do this." Alexandra nodded, tears streaming. "Do it. Let them face justice." Ben smiled faintly, hope shining through fatigue. "Love, you brought your daughters home. The rest will follow." Here, she finally entered the ambulance, sealing the door. As the paramedic waved to Ben, Alexandra leaned toward the girls. "You were so brave. I'm so proud of you." Across the tarmac, Ben walked to the SUV where suspects sat handcuffed, and police lines had been set. "Ready when you are," he said to the officers, lifting the envelopes as evidence. Within moments, a highway van approached to transport the suspects. Ben turned toward the station and met Alexandra's determined gaze as the ambulance rolled away. "Some of the local officers, yes. They were paid to look the other way," Detective Liu admitted, her voice tight with frustration. "They were told the children were relatives or family friends. Money and influence can corrupt, especially in small, isolated towns that rely on wealthy patrons to keep their economies alive." Alexandra's hands trembled slightly as she tried to process this. "Will you be able to find the other children, to bring them home?" "We're already coordinating with international agencies," Liu said firmly. "This is now a federal case, given its scope and the evidence we've uncovered. Your daughters are incredibly lucky. Many of these children have been missing for years, and we might never have found them without your determination." "Do you have enough to convict them?" Alexandra asked anxiously. "These men, they're powerful. What if they use their money and influence to escape justice?" "Between the physical evidence, the confessions we've obtained, and testimonies from witnesses like yourself, Roger and Justin, we have a solid foundation for prosecution," the detective reassured her. "Power only goes so far, especially in a case involving child trafficking. The law is clear, and we are committed to seeing this through." Alexandra nodded slowly, the crushing weight she had been carrying for the past 8 months beginning to lift, piece by piece. "And what about the corrupt officers? Will they face charges too?" Absolutely, Detective Liu replied. Internal Affairs has already launched a full investigation into the entire coastal station. Every officer will be questioned, and those found to be complicit will be prosecuted. Corruption within our ranks will not be tolerated. After answering a few final questions and signing her official statement, Alexandra was finally allowed to leave the interview room. As she stepped into the hallway, she was surprised to see Roger waiting for her. "He wanted to make sure you were okay," he said, rising to his feet, "and to offer you a ride to the hospital if you need one." "Thank you," Alexandra said sincerely, "for everything. If you hadn't spotted them from the air this morning, I don't know what would have happened." Roger shook his head. "I'm just glad I was in the right place at the right time." Just then, Ben appeared from another corridor. He looked exhausted but satisfied. "We're finished here," he said gently. "One of my officers can drive you to the hospital." Alexandra hesitated, then turned to Roger. "I'd actually like you to come with me, if that's okay. You were part of bringing them home. I'd like you to be there when they wake up." Roger blinked, surprised but touched. "I'd be honored." Ben gestured to a young officer nearby. "He'll drive you both." As they prepared to leave, Ben gently touched Alexandra's arm. "There's still a long road ahead with the legal proceedings, but the most important thing is that Casey and Chloe are safe. You did this, Alexandra. You never gave up." Tears welled in her eyes. "Thank you for believing in me, when so many others didn't." With that, she and Roger headed toward the hospital. For the first time in months, her heart felt light, her purpose fulfilled. She was finally on her way to see her daughters. The hospital corridor was quiet as Alexandra and Roger followed a nurse through its clean, echoing halls. Each step brought her closer to the moment she had dreamed about and feared might never come. The reunion. "They're doing well," the nurse explained as they approached a closed door. "The sedative they were given was mild, just enough to keep them calm. They've been awake for about 20 minutes now." Alexandra's heart pounded as they stopped in front of room 215. The nurse offered a kind smile. "Take as much time as you need." With trembling fingers, Alexandra pushed open the door. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting soft, golden light across the room. 2 small beds sat side by side. In them, alert but clearly still recovering, were Casey and Chloe. For a long moment, time stood still. Then, recognition lit up Casey's face. "Mommy!" she cried. Alexandra ran to them, gathering both girls into her arms. Her tears came freely, soaking into their hair as she held them close. "My babies!" she whispered. "Oh, my sweet girls! I've missed you so much." Chloe's tiny arms clung tightly around her neck. "You found us," she murmured. "You really found us, Mommy." "I never stopped looking," Alexandra choked out. She pulled back slightly to look at their faces. Thinner than she remembered, their hair longer, their skins sun-kissed from months outdoors, but their eyes, bright and familiar, were unmistakably her daughters. Casey's deep brown gaze, Chloe's hazel eyes, flecked with gold. "I searched the whole country for you," she whispered. "Everywhere. Every corner." A nurse entered briefly to check their vitals and confirmed that both girls were recovering well. The effects of the sedative had nearly worn off. As she left the room, Alexandra sat on the edge of one bed, holding a hand from each daughter, unwilling to let go. "This is Roger," she said softly, nodding toward where he stood quietly in the doorway. "He helped find you. He's a pilot." Roger stepped forward with a kind smile. "Hello there. I saw you both waving at my seaplane this morning when I flew over the island." Casey's eyes brightened. "I remember. We waved really big. We hoped someone would see us." "Well, it worked," Roger replied gently. "I saw you and recognized you right away from your mom's posters." Chloe reached out a hand toward him. "Thank you for saving us." Roger took her tiny hand in his. "It was a team effort. But I'm so glad you're safe now." Alexandra looked at both girls again, brushing hair from their faces. "You're home now. You're safe. And I promise, I'll never let anything happen to you again." The sunlight warmed their faces as the girls nestled into her arms, and for the first time in 8 unbearable months, Alexandra allowed herself to truly breathe. Alexandra leaned in and pressed gentle kisses to the tops of her daughters' heads. her hands cradling them as if to shield them from any lingering shadows of fear. Then, gathering all her strength, she asked the question that had haunted her through sleepless nights and endless days. Did they ever hurt you? The silence that followed made her heart freeze. But then both girls shook their heads. They were nice to us, Chloe said softly. Her small voice was filled with innocence, yet edged with confusion. They gave us toys and pretty dresses. They just made us pretend, Casey added, her tone more thoughtful, older than her 6 years. They said we had to call them uncle. We had to do whatever they said and act like we were their daughters. Alexandra's emotions twisted inside her, an impossible tangle of relief and fury. Relief that her daughters hadn't suffered physical abuse. Fury at how those men had stolen their identities, tricked them, and played cruel games with their trust. Casey's gaze lowered. Her lips trembled slightly. We shouldn't have gone with them that day. Tears welled up in her eyes as she added, But they said they had a princess castle to show us. They told us you knew about it. They said it was a surprise from you. Alexandra's heart shattered all over again. She pulled Casey close and hugged her tighter. No, sweetie, none of that was your fault. They lied to you. Adults should never ever lie to children, especially not to trick them. Chloe reached out and wrapped her small fingers around her mother's hand. We missed you every day, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The uncle told us you were on a trip and that you'd come get us soon. But you didn't come, so we knew they were lying. Tears streamed silently down Alexandra's face as she brushed a strand of hair behind Chloe's ear. I never stopped looking for you, she whispered. Not for one single day. What happens now, Mommy? Casey asked, her eyes wide, full of uncertainty. Do we go home? Alexandra nodded, managing a smile that finally reached her eyes. Yes, sweetheart, as soon as the doctors say you're healthy enough, we'll go home. Her voice broke with emotion as she added, We've got a lot of time to make up for, and I plan to spend every moment with you. Roger, who had been standing quietly by the door, cleared his throat gently. I should probably give you some time alone, he said, offering a kind smile. I'm really glad everything worked out. Alexandra looked up at him, her eyes shining. Thank you again, Roger. I don't know how I could ever repay you. He shook his head. Seeing this reunion, it's more than enough. Take care of each other. With one last smile toward the girls, he stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him. As the soft afternoon sunlight spilled across the floor, Alexandra sat between her daughters, listening as they recounted the past 8 months in the only way children could. Confused timelines, half-remembered names, strange routines. She answered their questions as gently as possible, offering comfort, explanations, and the reassurance that they were safe now. There would be many more questions later, interviews with specialists, therapy to help them process what they'd experienced, and ahead of them all, a long and painful legal process to hold their captors accountable. But for now, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Casey and Chloe were here, alive and safe. They had beaten the odds, defied the statistics that said most missing children were never found alive after so many months. They had made it home. I love you both so much, Alexandra said, her voice cracking with love and gratitude. And I promise we're going to be okay. The girls nestled against her, their small bodies warm against her sides, and Alexandra closed her eyes for a moment, just to feel it. The weight, the reality of them. The proof that this wasn't a dream. She thought back to the road that had led her here, one paved by her relentless hope, by the compassion of strangers, by chance, and by fate. A pilot flying low at just the right moment. A fisherman who had seen too much. A detective who trusted his instincts more than red tape. Sometimes love really was enough. Sometimes refusing to give up was all that stood between despair and reunion. And sometimes, just sometimes, hope was absolutely, defiantly, gloriously right.